Hey everyone! Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtains on one of history's best-kept secrets, the surprisingly questionable hygiene practices of Europe's most glamorous royal courts. Behind the gilded mirrors, beneath the powdered wigs, and within those magnificent palaces, sanitation was far from what anyone might expect. Before we dive into this fascinating journey through the less fragrant side of royal life, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if historical deep dives like this one capture the imagination. Feel free to drop a comment about where in the world everyone is watching from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this community stretch across continents. Now, settle in, maybe light a scented candle in tribute to the perfume-drenched nobles we'll be discussing, and let's explore together the surprisingly unglamorous reality of life in history's most celebrated palaces. When people imagine royal courts of the past, their minds often conjure images of pristine ballrooms, elegant ladies in flowing gowns, and distinguished gentlemen in elaborate costumes. The fantasy is one of refinement, sophistication, and impeccable cleanliness. The reality, however, was quite different. From the glittering halls of Versailles to the imposing corridors of Hampton Court, from the palaces of Madrid to the imperial residences of Vienna, royal courts across Europe shared a common characteristic that might surprise modern observers. Their hygiene practices range from questionable to genuinely alarming. This wasn't because royalty and nobility were inherently careless or ignorant. Rather, their hygiene habits reflected the medical understanding, cultural beliefs, and practical limitations of their times. What seems obvious to modern sensibilities, the importance of regular bathing, proper sanitation, dental care, was not at all clear to people living in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. In fact, many practices considered healthy and proper in those eras were exactly the opposite. The disconnect between the opulence of royal life and the reality of personal hygiene created some truly remarkable contradictions. Kings who ruled vast empires rarely bathed. Queens who wore gowns worth fortunes sometimes went weeks without washing. Nobles who dined on the finest foods suffered from rotten teeth and constant digestive complaints. Palaces that cost millions to build lacked basic sanitation, leading to conditions that would shock modern health inspectors. Understanding these contradictions requires setting aside contemporary assumptions and entering the mindset of a different era. To people of the royal courts, their practices made perfect sense based on the knowledge available to them. Water was dangerous. Night air carried disease. Certain substances could preserve health while others invited illness. These beliefs, however incorrect, shaped daily life in profound ways. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between modern and historical hygiene standards more dramatically than attitudes toward bathing. Today, daily showers or baths are considered basic necessities. In royal courts of the past, frequent bathing was viewed with suspicion, concern, and sometimes outright fear. The roots of this anti-bathing sentiment stretch back centuries. Medieval Europe had enjoyed robust bathing culture, with public bathhouses common in cities and towns. However, the 16th century brought changes that would reshape hygiene practices for generations. Medical theories of the time held that water could penetrate the skin and introduce disease into the body. Doctors warned that bathing opened pores, making people vulnerable to illness, particularly the dreaded plague that periodically swept across Europe. These medical theories weren't completely invented from nothing. Physicians observed that bathhouses sometimes seemed associated with disease outbreaks, though they misunderstood the cause. Poor sanitation in bathhouses, overcrowding and contaminated water could indeed spread illness, but doctors concluded the problem was bathing itself rather than the conditions under which it occurred. By the time of the great royal courts of the 17th and 18th centuries, bathing had become genuinely rare among the upper classes. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King who built Versailles and defined European court culture for generations, reportedly bathed only a few times in his entire life. This wasn't neglect or laziness. It was deliberate health practice based on medical advice from the finest physicians in Europe. Louis XIV's bathing habits, or lack thereof, became the standard that other courts emulated. When the French court set trends, other European nobility followed. If the Sun King avoided water, who were lesser nobles to question the practice? This created a cascade effect where bathing became increasingly rare among the upper classes across the continent. The few baths Louis XIV did take were elaborate affairs, carefully supervised by doctors. The water temperature was precisely controlled, the duration strictly limited, and the king was closely monitored for any signs of ill effects. Physicians stood ready to intervene if the bath seemed to be causing problems. These precautions reflected genuine medical concern, not mere superstition. Doctors truly believed that bathing posed serious health risks. Queen Elizabeth I of England, who reigned in the late 16th century, was considered exceptionally clean for her time because she bathed once a month whether she needed it or not, as one contemporary account noted with apparent admiration. This monthly bath was viewed as frequent to the point of being slightly eccentric. Most of her courtiers bathed far less often, perhaps a few times a year, or even less frequently. The Spanish court maintained similar practices. King Philip II, one of the most powerful monarchs of the 16th century, avoided bathing based on medical advice. Spanish court physicians were particularly emphatic about the dangers of water, warning that it weakened the body's natural defences and invited disease. This advice was followed not just by the king, but by the entire Spanish nobility. When bathing did occur in royal circles, it was often for specific medical purposes rather than general cleanliness. Therapeutic baths, prescribed by physicians for particular ailments, were considered acceptable. These medicinal baths used various additives, herbs, minerals, sometimes stranger substances, believed to treat specific conditions. The distinction was clear. Bathing for health purposes under medical supervision was occasionally necessary, but bathing for cleanliness was dangerous folly. The irony, of course, was that avoiding bathing created its own health problems. Skin conditions flourished in the absence of washing. Body odour became so pervasive that it was simply accepted as normal. Parasites, lice, fleas, and other unwelcome companions found ideal conditions in unwashed bodies and clothes. But because everyone at court experienced these problems, they seemed like unavoidable aspects of life rather than preventable conditions. Some royals did recognise that complete avoidance of water was impractical. Partial washing, cleaning hands, faces, occasionally feet, was more common than full-body bathing. These partial ablutions represented a compromise between medical fears about water and practical needs for some degree of cleanliness. Courtiers would wash visible areas that might betray dirt to observers, while leaving the rest of the body untouched for extended periods. The implements used for these limited washing sessions were themselves quite different from modern bathroom fixtures. Wash basins and pitchers replaced running water. Servants would bring water, usually cold or barely warm, to private chambers. The washing process was brief and focused on areas that would be visible: hands, face, neck. The water was rarely changed during washing, meaning that by the end of the process people were essentially rinsing with dirty water. Interestingly, there were occasional voices of dissent. Some physicians and natural philosophers questioned the prevailing anti-bathing wisdom. They observed that cultures with strong bathing traditions, such as the Ottoman Empire, didn't seem to suffer excessive illness. A few brave souls suggested that perhaps water wasn't as dangerous as commonly believed. However, these dissenting voices were largely ignored or dismissed by mainstream medical establishment. The situation began to change slowly in the 18th century as new scientific understanding emerged. Enlightenment thinkers started questioning traditional medical theories. Some courts began to cautiously embrace bathing again, though progress was gradual. Even as late as the early 19th century, many European nobles bathed infrequently by modern standards, though attitudes were slowly shifting. The transition back to regular bathing took decades and met resistance. Older courtiers, raised with anti-bathing beliefs, viewed the new fashion for cleanliness with suspicion. Generational conflicts arose, with younger nobles embracing bathing while their elders warned of health consequences. Palace infrastructure had to be updated to support bathing, a significant undertaking in buildings designed with the assumption that bathing would be rare. If royalty and nobility rarely bathed, how did they manage body odour? The answer lay in one of the most characteristic features of royal court culture: the lavish use of perfume. Perfume wasn't a pleasant accessory to cleanliness. It was a substitute for it. The perfume industry that flourished around royal courts existed largely to mask the reality of unwashed bodies. The quantities of perfume used at court would seem excessive even by modern standards for formal occasions. But in an era where bathing was rare, perfume application was essentially continuous. Courtiers would apply heavy perfumes multiple times daily, dousing themselves in scents designed to overpower any less pleasant odours emanating from their persons. French perfumers, particularly those in Grasse, became legendary for their ability to create powerful, long-lasting scents. They weren't creating subtle fragrances to complement natural cleanliness. They were developing olfactory armour strong enough to mask significant body odour. The perfumes needed to be potent, persistent, and complex enough to remain interesting, despite being applied in overwhelming quantities. The favourite scents of the era reflected this practical purpose. Heavy musks, ambergris, and civet, derived from animal sources, formed the base of many court perfumes. These animal-based scents had strong, lasting power capable of masking other odours. Layered on top were floral notes: rose, jasmine, violet, and spices like clove and cinnamon. The result was often overpoweringly strong, a sensory assault that modern noses would find difficult to tolerate. Louis XIV's court at Versailles was nicknamed the Perfumed Court, though this wasn't entirely a compliment. Visitors from less fragrant-obsessed regions found the atmosphere overwhelming. The combination of hundreds of heavily perfumed bodies in enclosed palace rooms created an olfactory environment unlike anything in the modern world. Contemporary accounts describe the smell as almost visible, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Perfume application techniques were elaborate. Courtiers didn't simply spray or dab perfume on pulse points as modern people might. Instead, perfume was applied liberally to clothing, wigs, handkerchiefs, gloves, and accessories. Perfume-soaked cloths were carried and frequently held to the nose. Rooms were fumigated with perfume burners. Even furniture and wall hangings were treated with fragrant substances. The expense of maintaining this perfumed existence was considerable. Quality perfumes were expensive, requiring rare ingredients imported from around the world. Ambergris, particularly prized, came from sperm whales and could cost more per ounce than gold. Musk and civet required harvesting from live animals, making them labour-intensive to obtain. A courtier's annual perfume budget could exceed what a common family might earn in a year. Social hierarchies were expressed through perfume. The finest scents were reserved for the highest ranks. Cheaper perfumes, often harsh and unpleasant, marked lower social positions. The ability to afford exceptional perfume signalled wealth and status, making perfume both practical necessity and status symbol. Gift-giving among nobles often involved perfumes, with rare scents presented as treasures comparable to jewels or gold. Perfumed gloves became particularly fashionable accessories. These weren't ordinary gloves with a light fragrance. They were leather gloves thoroughly impregnated with powerful perfume through lengthy treatment processes. The perfume would persist for months, providing constant scent. Catherine de' Medici, who moved from Italy to France to become queen, reportedly brought Italian perfumed glove-making techniques to France, launching a fashion that would dominate for centuries. Beyond masking body odour, perfume served another purpose according to medical theories of the time. Physicians believed that disease spread through miasmas, bad air-carrying illness. Strong perfume was thought to ward off these dangerous miasmas, protecting the wearer from disease. This belief gave perfume use an additional motivation beyond mere social acceptability. Courtiers believed they were literally protecting their health by surrounding themselves with strong scents. The miasma theory led to some interesting practices. During plague outbreaks or other epidemic diseases, perfume use intensified dramatically. Doctors wore beak-like masks filled with aromatic substances, believing the scents would protect them from infectious miasmas. Courtiers would increase their already heavy perfume application, creating nearly intolerable concentrations of scent in desperate attempts to ward off illness. Not everyone appreciated the perfumed atmosphere. Some visitors to royal courts complained of headaches, nausea, and difficulty breathing in the heavily scented environment. Those with sensitive noses found court attendance genuinely difficult, though complaining too loudly about the smell would have been a serious social mistake. The assumption was that proper refined people appreciated strong perfume. Only those of lower class would find such scents unpleasant. Some royals developed signature scents that became associated with them personally. Louis XV of France favoured a different perfume each day, rotating through an extensive collection. This daily variety was a luxury few could afford, showcasing his wealth and refinement. Marie Antoinette preferred lighter floral scents, particularly violet, which became trendy among her circle. Napoleon Bonaparte later famously bathed in Cologne, one of the few royals who genuinely enjoyed water, going through dozens of bottles monthly. The perfume industry that developed around royal courts had lasting impact. Many perfume houses that began by supplying European courts remain prestigious brands today, their histories stretching back centuries. The techniques developed to create powerful, lasting scents evolved into modern perfumery. In a strange way, the poor hygiene practices of royal courts drove innovation in fragrance creation that benefits people today. The magnificent palaces that housed royal courts were architectural marvels that inspired awe across Europe and beyond. Versailles, with its hall of mirrors and spectacular gardens, was the envy of every monarch. Hampton Court, Schönbrunn, the Royal Palace of Madrid, these buildings represented the pinnacle of architectural achievement. Yet for all their grandeur, these palaces had a fundamental problem. They lacked adequate sanitation facilities. Modern people might assume that buildings costing fortunes to construct would include sophisticated plumbing and waste disposal systems. The reality was quite different. Most royal palaces, even into the 18th century, had remarkably primitive sanitation that created persistent, unpleasant and unhealthy conditions. Versailles, the most famous palace in Europe, provides a striking example. At its height, Versailles housed approximately 10,000 people, the royal family, court nobles, servants, guards, and administrators. This population lived in a building with very few dedicated toilets. Estimates suggest there may have been as few as 100 chamber pots for the entire palace population. This mathematical impossibility led to predictable problems. Without sufficient proper facilities, palace residents improvised. Corners of corridors, spaces behind tapestries, seldom used rooms, even the palace gardens became impromptu toilets. Contemporary accounts describe the persistent problem of people relieving themselves in various palace locations. The smell, particularly in summer heat, became overwhelming in certain areas. The Palace of Versailles developed such a reputation for this problem that official positions existed specifically to clean waste from various locations. These unfortunate servants had the task of addressing the consequences of inadequate sanitation, though they fought a losing battle against thousands of residents and insufficient facilities. Chamber pots, when used, created their own challenges. Emptying chamber pots was a servant's duty, but where did the contents go? Sometimes they were properly disposed of in designated areas, but the sheer volume of waste produced daily by thousands of people exceeded the disposal capacity. More frequently, the quickest solution prevailed. Contents were simply dumped out windows into courtyards or gardens. This practice of emptying chamber pots from windows was so common that it acquired euphemistic names. In France, the warning cry "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, would supposedly precede such dumps, though how reliably this courtesy was observed is debatable. Palace gardens, despite their beauty, sometimes concealed unpleasant surprises in less trafficked areas. Even royalty wasn't exempt from sanitation challenges. Kings and queens had dedicated chamber pots, often elaborately decorated and made from fine materials, porcelain, silver, even gold in some cases. These close stools, or chaises percées, provided private facilities, but disposal remained an issue. Royal waste might receive more careful handling than commoners, but it still had to go somewhere. Louis XIV, despite his splendid palace, dealt with sanitation limitations like everyone else. The king famously conducted business while seated on his close stool, receiving visitors and discussing matters of state in this rather undignified position. This wasn't considered particularly shocking. Privacy expectations were quite different in an era where even royalty rarely had true solitude. The lack of proper plumbing meant that water for washing had to be carried to rooms by servants, then carried away after use. The volume of work this created was staggering. Thousands of servants spent much of their time hauling water upstairs, then hauling dirty water back down. This labour-intensive system meant that water for washing was used sparingly. Elaborate washing routines were impractical when each basin of water required a servant to climb multiple flights of stairs. Some palaces made efforts to improve sanitation over time. Hampton Court Palace in England was relatively progressive, with efforts to install better waste disposal systems beginning in the 16th century. However, even these improvements were limited by the technology available. true indoor plumbing with running water and proper sewage systems didn't exist. The best solutions involved slightly more sophisticated chamber pot arrangements and designated waste disposal areas. Palace architecture sometimes made sanitation problems worse. Large buildings with countless rooms, narrow hallways, and limited ventilation trapped odours. Thick stone walls and limited windows meant air circulation was poor. In winter, when windows remained shut against cold, conditions inside palaces could become genuinely unpleasant. The combination of thousands of unwashed bodies, inadequate toilet facilities, poor ventilation, and heavy perfume created an atmosphere that would shock modern sensibilities. Courtiers learned to navigate these conditions. Knowledge of which palace areas to avoid, particularly after large gatherings, became important social information. Certain corridors or wings developed reputations as particularly unpleasant. Savvy courtiers learned alternative routes through palaces to avoid the worst areas. The gardens of palace estates provided some relief. Fresh air, open space, and natural scents offered respite from indoor conditions. This partially explains the elaborate garden culture of royal courts. Gardens weren't merely decorative, they were functional escapes from problematic palace interiors. Walking in gardens became a popular court activity, partly because the outdoor air was genuinely more pleasant than indoor atmosphere. Seasonal variations affected palace conditions dramatically. Summer heat intensified every hygiene problem. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, adding rotting organic matter to the mix of unpleasant smells. Human and animal waste decomposed rapidly in warmth, creating even worse odours. Summer gatherings at palaces could be almost unbearable, despite the social brilliance of the occasions. Winter brought different challenges. Closing windows and doors to preserve warmth trapped odours inside. Heating came from fireplaces that added smoke to the already complex atmosphere. Snow and ice made disposing of waste more difficult, leading to accumulation. Winter court events, while avoiding summer's worst smells, occurred in stuffy, smoky environments with their own discomforts. Few aspects of royal court fashion were as distinctive or as problematic from a hygiene perspective as the elaborate wigs that dominated European courts from the mid-17th through the 18th centuries. These towering, powdered creations were magnificent to behold, but harboured some genuinely concerning hygiene issues. Wig culture began as a practical solution to a social problem. King Louis XIII of France began losing his hair at a young age, and took to wearing wigs to conceal his baldness. His son, Louis XIV, continued the practice, though the younger king's motivation was less about concealing hair loss and more about fashion and height enhancement. The Sun King was shorter than he preferred, and tall wigs added valuable inches to his stature. What began as royal personal preference quickly became mandatory court fashion. If the king wore elaborate wigs, courtiers needed to follow suit or risk appearing unfashionable or even disrespectful. The trend spread from France to other European courts until wigs became nearly universal among upper-class men, and increasingly common among women as well. The wigs themselves were marvels of construction. Made from human hair, horsehair, or sometimes goat hair, these pieces could take weeks to create. Wig makers were skilled artisans who commanded high prices for their work. A quality wig represented significant investment, equivalent to several months' wages for common workers. The elaborate styling process created towering structures. Hair was curled, teased, arranged over supporting frameworks, and built into shapes that defied gravity. Men's wigs typically featured rolled curls at the sides with a queue, ponytail at the back. Women's wigs, particularly in the later 18th century, could reach extraordinary heights, sometimes exceeding 2 or 3 feet above the head. To maintain these elaborate structures, wigs were powdered, heavily. The powder, usually made from finely ground starch or flour, was applied liberally to achieve the fashionable white or off-white colour that signified refinement and status. The powdering process created clouds of dust that settled throughout dressing rooms and required servant labour to manage. This is where hygiene problems began to emerge. The wigs themselves were rarely cleaned. The elaborate constructions were too delicate to wash in any thorough sense. Surface brushing removed loose powder and debris, but deep cleaning would destroy the careful styling. As a result, wigs accumulated dirt, dead skin cells, hair oils, and other substances over extended periods. The powder used on wigs created its own issues. Applied over layers of pomade and hair oils used to achieve the desired styling, the powder mixed with these substances to create a paste-like residue. This mixture trapped dirt, absorbed sweat and oils from scalps, and provided ideal breeding grounds for various unwanted inhabitants. Wigs became homes to lice and other parasites. The warm, dark interior of a powdered wig offered perfect conditions for these creatures to thrive. Once established, lice populations could grow substantially. Some historical accounts, though perhaps exaggerated, describe courtiers troubled by truly impressive infestations living in their fashionable hairpieces. The experience of wearing these wigs was often uncomfortable. The weight of elaborate constructions caused headaches and neck strain. The pomades and powders irritated sensitive skin. The poor ventilation meant scalps became sweaty and itchy. In summer heat, wigs were nearly unbearable, yet fashion demanded their constant wear at court. Scratching an itchy scalp beneath a wig without disturbing the elaborate construction required skill. Special scratching implements were developed, long, thin instruments designed to reach through the wig to the scalp below. These scratchers became common accessories, often beautifully crafted from ivory, precious metals, or exotic woods. The fact that specialized tools were needed to address itching reveals just how problematic wig wearing could be. Women's wigs reached peak elaboration in the 1770s and 1780s under the influence of fashion leaders like Marie Antoinette. These towering creations incorporated not just hair, but supporting structures, padding, and decorative elements. Entire scenes might be constructed atop heads, miniature gardens, ships in full sail, bird cages, even representations of current events. The height became so extreme that women sometimes couldn't fit through doorways or into carriages without bending or temporarily deflating their hairstyles. These elaborate women's wigs created even worse hygiene issues than men's relatively simpler styles. The complex structures with their padding and decorations were essentially impossible to clean. Women would have such styles constructed, then wear them for weeks or even months with only surface maintenance. During this time, the interior conditions can only be imagined. Contemporary satires made sport of wig hygiene problems. Cartoons depicted wigs as zoos for vermin, mice nesting in towering structures, and courtiers using increasingly ridiculous tools to address the discomfort. While exaggerated for humour, these satires reflected real concerns that people had about the sanitary state of fashionable hairstyles. Some royals and nobles developed allergic reactions or skin conditions from the pomades, powders, and general conditions associated with wig wearing. Rashes, inflammation, and infections weren't uncommon. Yet fashion demanded continued wear despite discomfort. To abandon wigs would be to abandon one's position in court society. The powdering process itself had interesting social implications. The application of powder required assistance, creating employment for servants and generating substantial powder consumption. Households would go through pounds of powder weekly, adding to expenses. The very wealthy used high-quality powders scented with flowers or spices. Lesser nobles made do with cheaper versions that might have less pleasant odours or poorer consistency. Wig-wearing declined gradually as the 18th century ended and the 19th century began. Changes in fashion, influenced partly by revolutionary movements that rejected aristocratic excess, made simpler, more natural hairstyles acceptable again. By the early 1800s, wigs had largely disappeared from daily wear, though they persisted in formal contexts like legal proceedings. The end of wig fashion must have brought genuine relief to many who had endured years of uncomfortable, unhygienic hairpieces. The ability to wash one's own hair regularly, to address itching directly, and to avoid the weight and discomfort of elaborate wigs represented tangible improvements in daily comfort. Perhaps no aspect of royal court hygiene, or lack thereof, had more visible and painful consequences than dental care, or rather, the near-complete absence of effective dental care. Smiling portraits of royalty and nobility from past centuries rarely show teeth for good reason. Dental health was often genuinely alarming. The fundamental problem was sugar. As trade with the New World and other distant regions expanded, sugar became increasingly available in Europe. The royal courts, with their substantial wealth, were among the first to access this exotic commodity in large quantities. Sugar-rich desserts, candied fruits, and sweetened beverages became court staples, marking refined taste and social status. This sugar consumption came without any understanding of its effects on dental health. The connection between sugar and tooth decay wasn't understood until much later. Courtiers consumed sweet foods and drinks throughout the day, allowing sugar to constantly bathe their teeth, creating perfect conditions for decay. Making matters worse, dental hygiene practices were essentially non-existent. Toothbrushes, as we'd recognise them, didn't come into widespread use until the late 18th or early 19th century. Earlier brushing implements existed: cloths, twigs with frayed ends, primitive brushes made from animal bristles, but their use was sporadic and methods often ineffective. Some people cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with cloths, sometimes moistened with water or wine. More elaborate preparations might include abrasive powders meant to scrub teeth clean. However, these powders were often too abrasive, actually damaging tooth enamel while removing stains. Some formulations contained substances we'd now recognise as harmful, acids that dissolved enamel, or coarse particles that scratched teeth. The wealthy had access to tooth powders that might contain ingredients like crushed coral, cuttlefish bone, brick dust, or even pulverised pottery. These were applied with cloth or primitive brushes, rubbed across teeth in what was believed to be thorough cleaning. In reality, the abrasive nature of these powders often caused more problems than they solved, wearing down enamel and creating surfaces where bacteria could more easily establish themselves. Without effective cleaning, without understanding of cavity prevention, and with diets high in sugar, tooth decay was rampant among the royal courts. By middle age, many nobles had lost multiple teeth. Complete tooth loss was common by old age if people lived that long. Contemporary portraits sometimes show people with sunken cheeks and collapsed facial structures, characteristic of extensive tooth loss. The pain associated with tooth decay and dental abscesses was severe, and treatment options were limited and crude. When a tooth became too painful, extraction was the only real solution. Dental surgery existed but was primitive and performed without anaesthesia. The patient would be held down while a barber surgeon, using forceps and sometimes substantial force, would attempt to remove the offending tooth. These extractions were traumatic experiences. Without anaesthesia, the pain was extraordinary. Without antiseptics, infections were common. The forceps and techniques were crude, sometimes breaking teeth rather than removing them cleanly, or damaging surrounding teeth and jawbone. Many people avoided extraction as long as possible despite ongoing pain, simply because the extraction itself was so awful. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously suffered from dental problems. Contemporary accounts describe her reluctance to have teeth extracted despite severe pain, finally submitting only when persuaded by a courtier who had his own healthy tooth pulled to demonstrate it was survivable. By the end of her life, she had lost so many teeth that her face had collapsed inward, a visible sign of the dental decay that plagued her era. False teeth existed, but were rare, expensive, and quite problematic. Early dentures were carved from ivory or bone, sometimes made from actual human teeth purchased from the poor or extracted from corpses. These dentures didn't fit well, were uncomfortable, and often didn't look particularly natural. They had to be removed for eating, as they weren't designed to withstand chewing forces. The wealthy who could afford false teeth often found them disappointing. The dentures would slip, cause pain, and simply didn't function like real teeth. Some people gave up on them quickly, preferring toothless existence to the frustration of managing primitive dentures. Others persisted, accepting the discomfort as part of maintaining appearances at court. Toothaches and dental infections caused more than just local pain. Dental abscesses could spread infection through the bloodstream, causing serious systemic illness. Some historians believe that dental problems may have contributed to various royal deaths, though diagnosing cause of death centuries later is necessarily speculative. The visible consequences of poor dental health marked nearly everyone at court to some degree. Stained teeth were universal. The wealthy might have teeth blackened by decay, while others showed brown discoloration from various substances. Missing teeth were common enough that they attracted little comment. Only young people might still have full sets of relatively healthy teeth, and even they often showed early signs of decay. Bad breath was another inevitable consequence of poor dental health. Tooth decay, gum disease, and dental infections all produce characteristic unpleasant odours. Combined with the already limited bathing practices and heavy perfume use, court atmosphere must have been quite distinctive. Breath fresheners existed, aromatic seeds, herbs, or spices that might be chewed, but these only temporarily mask deeper problems. Some courtiers tried various remedies to preserve or whiten teeth. Formulations might include vinegar, aqua fortis, nitric acid, or other acids that were believed to clean and whiten. These acidic treatments actually dissolved enamel, hastening rather than preventing decay. The quest for white teeth, already a status symbol as it suggested youth and health, led people to damage their teeth in pursuit of cosmetic improvement. Interestingly, some cultures and regions had slightly better dental health than others, usually correlated with lower sugar consumption. Areas where sugar remained expensive and rare, limiting its consumption, saw less severe tooth decay. This geographical variation in dental health went largely unnoticed at the time, as the connection between sugar and decay wasn't understood. The magnificent garments that symbolised royal court fashion, elaborate gowns with layers of silk, embroidered coats, lace-trimmed shirts, represented the height of sartorial achievement. Yet these beautiful clothes concealed a rather unpleasant reality. They were rarely washed, and when they were cleaned, the process was often inadequate by modern standards. The fundamental issue was that clothing cleaning was difficult, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to expensive garments. The fabrics used in court clothing, silks, velvets, brocades, intricate laces, couldn't withstand washing in the ways that simpler fabrics could. Water could damage silk, cause velvet to lose its texture, shrink expensive wools, or destroy delicate embroidery. As a result, outer garments were cleaned very infrequently, sometimes never over their entire lifespan. Instead of washing, clothing maintenance focused on spot cleaning visible stains, brushing to remove surface dirt, and airing garments to reduce odours. These methods were better than nothing, but hardly constituted thorough cleaning. The interiors of garments, pressed against unwashed bodies, accumulated sweat, oils, dead skin cells, and various other substances over time. The elaborate gowns worn by court ladies exemplified these problems. A single formal gown might incorporate dozens of yards of silk, intricate embroidery requiring thousands of hours of skilled work, jewels and other decorative elements worth small fortunes. Such garments couldn't simply be tossed in a washtub. Instead, they received careful surface maintenance, while their interiors remained largely untouched. The stomachers, bodices and underskirts that formed the foundation of women's formal dress were particularly problematic. These pieces sat directly against the body, absorbing perspiration and body oils. The tight-laced corsets that shaped women's figures pressed firmly against skin for hours at a time. Yet these undergarments went long periods without washing due to the difficulty of cleaning them without damaging their structure and materials. Men's clothing had similar issues. The elaborate coats, waistcoats and breeches that formed court dress were made from expensive fabrics with intricate tailoring. These garments were brushed, aired, and spot-cleaned but rarely fully washed. The wigs discussed earlier sat atop heads beneath hats that were also rarely cleaned, creating layers of unwashed fabric and hair. Linen undergarments, shirts, shifts, stockings, were the exception to this pattern. Linen could withstand washing relatively well, and because these items sat closest to skin, they required more frequent cleaning. Changes of linen were how people achieved a semblance of cleanliness. Fresh linen shirts or shifts would be donned, offering temporary cleanliness against the skin even as outer garments remained unwashed. The importance of clean linen in an era of infrequent bathing and rarely washed outer clothing cannot be overstated. Linen served as a barrier between body and expensive outer garments. It absorbed sweat and oils that would otherwise soil silks and velvets. The wealthy owned multiple sets of linen undergarments, allowing for regular changes. In fact, the visibility of clean white linen at collar and cuffs served as a status symbol. It demonstrated both wealth, the ability to afford multiple linen sets, and the servants to launder them, and refinement, proper attention to personal presentation. However, even linen wasn't washed with the frequency modern people might expect. Laundry, as discussed in the medieval women's script, was labour-intensive work. In royal courts with hundreds or thousands of residents, the volume of laundry created was staggering. Large estates employed substantial laundry staffs who worked constantly to keep up with demand. Still, the practical limitations meant that even linen might go a week or more between washings. The methods used to wash linens also had limitations. The harsh soaps and lye solutions that could clean linen effectively also damaged fabrics over time. Linens that went through repeated harsh washings would gradually weaken, yellow, and develop thin spots. The wealthy accepted this as the trade-off for cleanliness, budgeting to replace linens regularly. Those with fewer resources had to balance the desire for clean clothes against the need to preserve what they owned. Ironically, the elaborate court fashions with their layers and complexity were partly a response to hygiene limitations. Multiple layers meant that body soil affected only the innermost garments. The visible outer layers remained relatively protected. The progression from inner shift to outer gown, or from inner shirt to waistcoat to coat, created barriers that kept the most valuable and difficult to clean items somewhat removed from the body. The colours and patterns favoured in court dress also reflected practical realities. While pure white linen showed cleanliness, outer garments in darker colours, rich patterns, and busy designs helped conceal minor stains and soiling. The elaborate embroidery, jewelled decorations, and complex fabric patterns that characterised court dress served both aesthetic and practical purposes. They were beautiful, and they camouflaged the inevitable accumulation of dirt. Perfuming clothing served similar dual purposes. Fabrics were treated with scents, hung in perfumed wardrobes, or had sachets of aromatic substances placed among them. This perfuming made clothes smell pleasant, or at least less unpleasant despite infrequent washing. The perfumed clothes also transferred scent to the wearer, adding to the overall perfumed atmosphere that characterised court life. Some garments were considered private versus public, with different maintenance standards. Clothing worn only in private chambers might receive less careful attention than garments worn before the court. This created wardrobes divided not just by purpose, morning dress, evening dress, hunting attire, but by audience. Some clothes were acceptable for private life, while others met public standards. The expense and difficulty of maintaining court wardrobes created employment for numerous servants. Dressers, who helped nobles into their elaborate clothes, also maintained these garments between wearings. They brushed, spot-cleaned, aired, mended and stored clothing. This was skilled work requiring knowledge of different fabrics and appropriate care techniques. A good dresser was valued and could command higher wages than ordinary servants. Despite best efforts, court clothing often carried unmistakable signs of its limited cleaning. Contemporary accounts occasionally mention the smell of court gatherings, noting that crowded rooms filled with heavily perfumed but infrequently washed nobles created distinctive atmosphere. Visitors from regions with different hygiene practices sometimes commented, with varying degrees of diplomacy, on the olfactory characteristics of European courts. The fashion for fans, popular among court ladies, served multiple purposes beyond signalling and flirtation. Fans allowed women to create personal air circulation, providing some relief in crowded, overheated rooms filled with unwashed bodies and heavy perfume. The fan could also be deployed to block unpleasant smells, either from one's own clothes or from neighbouring courtiers. The chamber pot, that humble vessel, played a central and surprisingly public role in royal court life. The handling of personal waste, an intimate matter in modern society, was far less private in historical courts. This lack of privacy created situations that modern people would find extraordinary. Royalty, particularly kings, sometimes conducted business while using chamber pots. This wasn't considered shocking or inappropriate. It was simply practical use of time. Courtiers might be granted audiences while the monarch sat on a close stool, the euphemistic term for an elaborate chamber pot. Important matters of state could be discussed, appointments made, and decisions rendered in this rather intimate setting. Louis XIV of France was famous for receiving visitors while seated on his chaise percée. The king's morning routine, known as the levee, involved various court nobles attending him through his morning ablutions, dressing, and yes, his use of the chamber pot. Positions as groom of the stool or similar titles were actually prestigious appointments, as they involved intimate access to the monarch. The people who attended the king during these private moments gained influence through their proximity to power. This practice seems bizarre to modern sensibilities, but it reflected the different relationship between privacy and power in royal courts. The king's body was, in a sense, public property. Everything about it was significant, from his health to his daily functions. Attending the king during intimate moments wasn't degrading. It was privileged access to the centre of power. The chamber pots themselves reflected status. Royal close stools were elaborate pieces of furniture, often upholstered, sometimes gilded, designed to look like regular chairs or stools while concealing their true purpose. The wealthiest nobles had silver or porcelain chamber pots. Common courtiers made do with pottery or simpler vessels. The quality of one's chamber pot was, absurdly enough, a status marker. The disposal of chamber pot contents created the sanitation problems discussed earlier. With thousands of people producing waste daily and insufficient facilities for proper disposal, the contents had to go somewhere. The official channels, designated pits or disposal areas, couldn't handle the volume. The result was people disposing of waste through whatever means were most convenient, often with unfortunate consequences for palace cleanliness. Servants responsible for emptying chamber pots had unenviable positions in the household hierarchy. This was considered degrading work, assigned to lower-ranking servants. The sheer volume they handled daily was substantial. In large palaces, teams of servants worked constantly at this task, moving through rooms, collecting vessels, transporting contents to disposal areas, cleaning pots, and returning them. The smell associated with chamber pots and their disposal pervaded palace life. Despite perfumes, despite attempts at sanitation, the reality of thousands of people producing waste created unavoidable odours. Certain areas of palaces, particularly near disposal points or in less ventilated corridors, were known for particularly unpleasant atmosphere. Nighttime presented special challenges. Without electric lights, navigating dark palace corridors to find chamber pots or toilet facilities was difficult and potentially dangerous. Most people kept chamber pots in their sleeping chambers for nighttime use. This meant sleeping in rooms that contained vessels of waste until morning removal. The nighttime odours in sleeping chambers can only be imagined. The architectural design of palaces didn't adequately address these realities. Rooms for sleeping, dressing and living rarely included dedicated sanitation facilities. Even the wealthy might have beautiful bedchambers that lacked anywhere to properly manage bodily functions except for portable chamber pots. The disconnect between the opulence of palace architecture and the primitive state of sanitation facilities is one of history's greater ironies. Some palaces attempted innovations. Closets or small rooms designated for chamber pot use provided slightly more privacy and containment. These weren't toilets in the modern sense, they still involved chamber pots, but the dedicated space was an improvement over using vessels wherever convenient. However, these facilities were limited in number and often reserved for the highest-ranking residents. The experience of court life included navigating these sanitation realities. Knowing where chamber pots were located, understanding disposal routines and timing one's needs accordingly were practical skills courtiers developed. Discussions of such matters were avoided in polite conversation, but the realities couldn't be completely ignored. Visitors to court sometimes struggled with these arrangements, those from regions with different sanitation practices or from less crowded environments found palace facilities inadequate. However, complaining too directly about such matters would have been rude and potentially damaging to one's social standing. One learned to adapt without comment. The gradual improvement in palace sanitation came slowly. As the 18th century progressed and moved into the 19th, awareness grew that current arrangements were inadequate. Efforts to install better facilities, to improve waste disposal, and to reduce odours became more serious. However, true modern plumbing with running water and proper sewage systems didn't arrive in most palaces until the 19th century, well after the era of the great royal courts had passed. The medical care available to royalty and nobility, despite being the best that money could buy, was often more harmful than helpful. Physicians of the era, working with incorrect understanding of human biology and disease, employed treatments that modern medicine recognises as at best ineffective and at worst deadly. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical intervention. Based on the theory of humoral medicine, the belief that health depended on balancing 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Physicians regularly bled patients to rebalance these humours. The amount of blood removed could be substantial, sometimes a pint or more. For patients already weakened by illness, this blood loss often worsened their condition. Royal patients received bloodletting for almost any complaint. Headaches, fevers, digestive problems, fatigue. All might be treated by removing blood. The procedure was performed using lancets to open veins, or leeches that attached to skin and drew blood. Leeches were particularly popular for certain treatments, considered more precise than lancets for bleeding specific body areas. The equipment used for bloodletting was rarely sterilised in ways we'd recognise. Lancets might be wiped clean, but weren't properly disinfected between patients. Leeches were sometimes reused after being made to regurgitate the blood they'd consumed. These practices spread infection, adding new health problems to whatever condition brought the patient to treatment in the first place. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhoea, was another standard treatment. The logic was similar to bloodletting. Expelling contents would supposedly rebalance humours and remove disease-causing substances. Strong emetics and purgatives were administered, sometimes in alarming doses. Patients would endure hours of vomiting and diarrhoea, emerging weak and dehydrated. Physicians interpreted this weakened state as evidence that the disease had been expelled. Mercury was a favoured treatment for various conditions, particularly syphilis, which was epidemic among European upper classes. Mercury compounds were applied externally, taken internally, or used in fumigations where patients would inhale mercury vapours. Mercury is, of course, highly toxic. The treatment caused mercury poisoning with symptoms including tremors, psychological disturbances, and organ damage. Some historians believe mercury treatment killed more patients than syphilis did. The side effects of mercury treatment were miserable. Excessive salivation was common. Patients might produce several pints of saliva daily, requiring constant spitting. Teeth would loosen and fall out, gums would swell and become sore, skin would develop rashes. Despite these obvious signs of poisoning, physicians persisted with mercury because they believed the salivation and other symptoms were evidence that the disease was being expelled. Court physicians also prescribed elaborate concoctions containing dozens of ingredients. These theriac mixtures might include herbs, minerals, animal products, and stranger substances. Powdered precious stones, ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk or rhinoceros horn, bezoars, stones from animal stomachs, all might be included in medicines. The elaborate recipes and expensive ingredients appealed to wealthy patients who believed effective medicine should be costly and complex. Some prescribed treatments involved truly unusual substances. Mummy powder, made from grinding up Egyptian mummies, was considered medicinally valuable. Urine was used both internally and externally for various conditions. Animal dung might be applied to wounds. These treatments seem absurd today, but they reflected the medical theories of the time and were seriously prescribed by learned physicians. Royal childbirth involved particular medical interventions that often endangered rather than helped mothers and infants. Physicians might bleed pregnant women regularly, believing this prevented excessive blood accumulation. During difficult labour, they might employ forceps without proper knowledge of their use, causing terrible injuries. The lack of understanding about infection meant that examining physicians would move from patient to patient without washing hands, spreading puerperal fever that killed many new mothers. Despite having access to the finest physicians available, royalty often received harmful medical care. In fact, some historians argue that wealthy patients with access to physicians fared worse than poor people who couldn't afford medical care and thus avoided its dangers. The elaborate interventions, toxic medications, and invasive procedures may have actually reduced survival rates compared to simply letting bodies heal themselves. This irony wasn't lost on some contemporary observers. Satirists occasionally mocked physicians and their treatments, suggesting that doctors were more interested in fees than cures. However, the mainstream view held that physicians possessed specialised knowledge that made their treatments valuable, despite outcomes that were often disappointing. The magnificent feasts that characterised royal court dining represented culinary achievement and social theatre. Multi-course meals featuring exotic ingredients, elaborate preparations, and artistic presentations impressed guests and demonstrated royal wealth. Yet these impressive meals created various hygiene and health problems that diminished their glamour considerably. Utensils as we know them were less common than modern people might assume. Forks didn't become standard dining implements in most of Europe until the 17th or 18th centuries. Before their widespread adoption, people ate primarily with knives, personal knives carried by diners rather than provided by hosts, and their hands. Even after forks became more common, many diners, particularly men, preferred traditional hand-eating methods. Hand-eating in an era of infrequent washing meant that food was handled by hands that might not have been cleaned in days. While diners would rinse hands in finger bowls provided during meals, this superficial washing did little to address deeper uncleanliness. The combination of multiple diners reaching into shared platters with unwashed hands created significant potential for spreading illness. The serving style compounded these issues. Rather than plated individual servings, most dishes were placed on tables where diners would serve themselves from communal platters. Diners would reach into these shared dishes, often with hands, extracting pieces of meat, scooping up sauces, or grabbing vegetables. What one person touched, others might subsequently eat. In large court banquets with hundreds of diners, the potential for disease transmission was substantial. Food safety was another major concern. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. Meat, fish, and dairy products would begin deteriorating within hours in warm weather. Large court kitchens preparing food for hundreds of people had to work quickly to minimise the time between preparation and service, but some spoilage was probably inevitable. The heavy use of spices in court cuisine served partly to disguise the taste of meat that wasn't perfectly fresh. Strong flavours from pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and other expensive spices could mask slight off flavours from meat that was starting to turn. While spices were also status symbols and genuine flavour preferences, their practical function in covering less than ideal meat quality shouldn't be overlooked. Meat safety was particularly concerning. The wealthy consumed large quantities of meat, often in elaborate preparations. Roasted game, fowl, beef, pork. Meat appeared at most meals. However, the meat came from animals that might have been diseased, was butchered without modern sanitary standards, and was prepared in kitchens where cross-contamination was likely. Parasites in undercooked pork, bacterial contamination in poultry, and various other foodborne hazards were common. The lengthy, multi-course banquets popular at courts meant food sat out for extended periods. A formal dinner might last several hours, during which time food would be displayed on tables. Early courses would sit at room temperature while later courses were consumed. In summer heat, this created ideal conditions for bacterial growth in already vulnerable foods. Court kitchens themselves, though impressive in size and equipment, lacked modern sanitation understanding. Multiple dishes would be prepared simultaneously, using the same surfaces and implements, without proper cleaning between uses. Kitchen staff might handle raw meat, then prepare salads, then work with desserts without washing hands or changing clothes. The potential for cross-contamination was enormous. Drinking water quality was questionable at best. Most people recognised that water from urban sources might be unsafe, leading to the preference for ale, wine, or other beverages. However, these drinks weren't always safer. Contaminated water used in brewing or winemaking could still transmit disease. The alcohol content of most table beverages was lower than modern beer or wine, providing less preservative effect against bacteria. The digestive complaints that plagued court life reflected these food safety and hygiene issues. Contemporary accounts frequently mention digestive distress, stomach pains, diarrhoea, nausea, among courtiers. These symptoms likely resulted from various combinations of spoiled food, bacterial contamination, parasitic infections, and the generally rich, heavy diet that characterized court cuisine. Medical advice about digestion reflected the era's misunderstanding. Physicians might recommend purging, inducing diarrhoea, to treat digestive problems, not realizing that the diarrhoea itself was a symptom of foodborne illness. The treatments often made conditions worse, adding to the patient's discomfort and potentially spreading infection if the illness was contagious. Parasitic infections were common among the wealthy despite, or perhaps partly because of, their rich diet. Tapeworms from undercooked meat, roundworms from contaminated produce, and various other parasites found hosts among nobles who consumed diverse foods from varied sources. The symptoms, abdominal pain, mysterious weight loss, fatigue, were often misdiagnosed and attributed to humoral imbalances rather than parasitic infections. The pursuit of beauty at royal courts led to cosmetic practices that were often actively harmful to health. The pale, powdered complexion favoured by court beauty standards required products containing ingredients we now know to be toxic. The quest for idealised appearance came at a genuine cost to those who pursued it. White lead, a compound of lead, formed the base of many fashionable face powders and foundations. Lead-based cosmetics created the smooth, pale white complexion that was highly prized. Pale skin signified that one didn't work outdoors and thus belonged to the leisure class. The whiter the complexion, the more refined and aristocratic one appeared. The problem, obviously, was that lead is highly toxic. Regular application of lead-based cosmetics introduced this poison through the skin. Symptoms of lead poisoning included headaches, fatigue, memory problems, mood changes, and eventually more severe effects including muscle weakness and organ damage. Long-term use could be genuinely dangerous or even fatal. Some famous beauties of the era may have suffered significant health consequences from their cosmetic routines. Queen Elizabeth I, famous for her white painted face, used lead-based cosmetics extensively throughout her life. Some historians speculate that the lead, combined with other ingredients in her cosmetics, contributed to health problems she experienced in later life, though definitive proof is impossible to establish centuries later. The application of these lead-based cosmetics was elaborate and required skill. The face would first be prepared with various bases and primers, then the white lead mixture would be carefully painted on, building up an opaque white layer. This had to be done carefully to avoid an obviously painted appearance. The goal was smooth, pale skin that appeared natural, though of course covering faces in white paint never truly looked natural. Once applied, the white lead layer was fragile. Smiling, frowning, or other facial expressions could crack the cosmetic layer, requiring careful repair. Women wearing heavy white makeup learned to minimize facial movements to preserve their painted complexions. This led to the rather immobile facial expressions sometimes noted in portraits of the era. The subjects weren't necessarily staid and serious, they were partly trying not to crack their makeup. Red rouge for cheeks and lips introduced additional chemicals. Mercury-based compounds produced bright red colours prized for cosmetic use. The mercury, like lead, was toxic, adding another poisonous metal to the mix applied to faces. The combination of lead-based white foundation and mercury-based rouge meant that fashionable women were literally painting their faces with poisons. The pursuit of pale skin extended beyond face painting. Women used various methods to lighten their overall skin tone. Some consumed chalk or other light-coloured substances, believing this would lighten them from within. Others practiced bloodletting specifically to achieve a paler, more delicate appearance by reducing blood in the cheeks. These practices were uncomfortable at best, and dangerous at worst. Eyebrows presented another challenge. Fashion sometimes favoured thin, high eyebrows or specific shapes that didn't match natural growth patterns. Women would pluck eyebrows extensively, sometimes removing them entirely and drawing in replacements with cosmetic pencils. The repeated plucking sometimes prevented regrowth, leaving women dependent on drawn eyebrows for the rest of their lives. Belladonna, derived from the deadly nightshade plant, was used to dilate pupils. Large pupils were considered attractive, giving eyes a luminous quality. Women would place belladonna drops in their eyes before social occasions. The dilated pupils did create the desired appearance, but also caused blurred vision and light sensitivity. Belladonna is, as its source plant's name suggests, quite toxic, and the practice wasn't without risks. Hair required its own cosmetic interventions. Elaborate dyed and styled hair was fashionable, requiring harsh chemical treatments. Hair dyes of the era might contain lead, mercury, or other toxic metals that would be applied to the scalp, introducing these substances into the body. The bleaching agents used to lighten hair were caustic, damaging hair, and potentially burning scalps. Men weren't exempt from cosmetic risks. Face powders and skin treatments were used by fashionable gentlemen as well as ladies. The heavy white powder applied to wigs introduced the same ingredients to men that face cosmetics introduced to women. Additionally, men might use cosmetics to cover poxmarks, skin blemishes, or other imperfections considered unsuitable for court appearance. The preparation of these cosmetics was itself hazardous. Servants or hired cosmetic preparers who made white lead foundations would inhale lead dust, absorbing the metal through their lungs. These workers suffered occupational exposure to levels of lead that often caused serious poisoning. The makers of beauty products paid a health price so that nobles could pursue fashionable appearance. Removing the thick layers of lead-based cosmetics at the end of the day required special preparations. Cleansing creams and solutions, often containing their own questionable ingredients, would be massaged into the painted face to dissolve and lift away the cosmetics. The skin underneath, after months or years of this routine, often showed damage, discoloration, scarring, premature aging, creating a vicious cycle where more cosmetics were needed to cover the damage caused by cosmetics. Some individuals developed allergic reactions or sensitivities to cosmetic ingredients, causing rashes, swelling, or more severe reactions. Yet social pressure to conform to beauty standards often meant continuing to use problematic products despite discomfort. The alternative, appearing at court without proper cosmetic enhancement, was socially unacceptable for anyone who cared about their position. Occasionally voices of concern were raised. Some physicians warned about the dangers of lead and mercury in cosmetics. A few treatises were written suggesting safer alternatives. However, these warnings largely went unheeded. Fashion and social pressure overwhelmed health concerns. The beautiful appearance created by dangerous cosmetics seemed, to those who used them, worth whatever risks might be involved. And so, as we step back from the gilded mirrors and perfumed corridors of history's most celebrated courts, a different picture emerges from the one that romantic histories often paint. These palaces of legendary magnificence, these halls where Europe's fate was decided and art and culture flourished, were also places where basic hygiene was often tragically neglected. The kings and queens who shaped nations rarely bathed. Their magnificent clothing masked unwashed bodies, and their dazzling smiles concealed rotting teeth. Yet understanding these realities doesn't diminish the accomplishments of the era. It simply reveals them as human achievements, created by real people with all the limitations and contradictions that humanity entails. The same Louis XIV, who almost never bathed, also built Versailles and established France as Europe's cultural centre. The same Elizabeth I, whose teeth were rotted by sugar, also guided England through its golden age. Marie Antoinette's towering, vermin-harbouring wigs existed alongside her patronage of art and her role in the complex politics of late 18th century Europe. These hygiene practices reflected the medical understanding and cultural beliefs of their times. People weren't willfully dirty. They were following what they believed to be healthy practices based on the best medical advice available. When doctors warned that bathing invited disease, when physicians prescribed mercury for illness, when beauty standards demanded toxic cosmetics, people followed these guidelines because they trusted the experts and authorities of their era. The gradual improvement in hygiene practices came as scientific understanding evolved. As germ theory developed in the 19th century, as the connections between cleanliness and health became clear, as water systems improved and sanitation infrastructure was built, the conditions that characterized royal courts finally began to change. The transformation wasn't instant. It took decades for new practices to replace old habits. But eventually the courts and palaces of Europe did embrace bathing, sanitation, and cleanliness. Modern life, with its indoor plumbing, daily showers, toothbrushes, and deodorant, exists in sharp contrast to these historical realities. The casual cleanliness that contemporary people take for granted represents genuine progress, the fruit of scientific advancement and public health initiatives. Understanding how differently people once lived helps appreciate the genuine improvements that modern sanitation and hygiene practices represent. These historical hygiene habits also serve as a reminder about the importance of questioning assumptions and seeking evidence-based practices. The royal courts, despite having access to the finest physicians and greatest wealth, often received advice that harmed rather than helped. Blindly following authority, even expert authority, without questioning or testing effectiveness, led to practices that persisted long after they should have been abandoned. The lesson remains relevant. Evidence and critical thinking matter more than tradition or authority alone. Perhaps most importantly, these stories humanize the legendary figures of history. Seeing them as people who struggled with lice, suffered from toothaches, and dealt with the daily realities of unwashed bodies makes them more relatable despite the centuries that separate us. They weren't untouchable icons living in pristine perfection. They were humans navigating their world with the tools and knowledge available to them, just as people do today. So as the candles dim and the palace corridors grow quiet in our imaginations, there's something both humbling and oddly comforting in recognizing that history's most celebrated courts, for all their glory and grandeur, were inhabited by people who faced challenges both timeless and uniquely tied to their era, proving once again that beneath the crowns, the titles, and the magnificent trappings of power, royalty has always been fundamentally and sometimes uncomfortably human.